Hi, everybody. Good morning. Thanks for coming out to the Missouri History Museum. My name is Cecily Hunter, and I'm public historian for the African American History Initiative, and we are so glad that you all came out today in honor of the Black collecting process, which we'll talk about today. Seeing some familiar faces from programs that we've had just last week and some other folks, so glad that you all are with us. So at the museum, we typically offer our programs to you all for free, and this is in large part because of the members that we have. So if you're not a member, we would love it if you would become one so that you can support the work that we are doing and that is ongoing. And MHS's Black History Month programming is presented by Wells Fargo. So when you all arrived, you should have received an evaluation for the program. So this typically helps us as we plan programs in the future. So if you would be so kind as to fill that out and then provide that to one of the MHS staff as you exit, we would greatly appreciate that feedback. During today's program, you will learn about the collecting efforts that we have as it relates to the African American History Initiative. Gwen Moore, the curator of urban landscape and community identity, preserves, assembles, as well as tells stories through historic artifacts. So today, in honor of that, you will get a chance to hear from her and all the work that she has been doing and continues to do as we expand our collecting efforts. So, we do know that, African American collecting efforts here at MHS has not always been a priority. So this is in large part because of the work that she's been doing that we're able to have access to many of the works that we do have. So definitely grateful for all the work that Gwen does. So if you all will please join me in welcoming her to the stage with a round of applause.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you for coming. Since we're in such a small group, could I get you to come down a little closer? I think we can have a more intimate conversation. And, I like to quote W.B. Du Bois, who says, you make a virtue out of a necessity. So we're going to make this a virtue. In fact, I kind of like this small group. It'll allow us to engage more. And so let me just tell you about the African American Collecting Initiative. As Cicely mentioned, that just to be very honest, we're kind of late to the game as far as collecting from the African American community. In 2014, we, with the generous support of Emerson Electric, we launched an African American History Initiative. And a component of that initiative was a collecting initiative that we wanted to gather the objects, the photographs, the papers, the moving images, everything that would help us to tell the story of African Americans in the region, and more specifically the city of St. Louis, but we focus on the whole metropolitan region. And because if you don't tell the whole story, you don't tell the real story. You don't tell the factual story. You don't tell the authentic story. You cannot leave out anybody's stories, despite what we're hearing from a lot of legislatures across the country that are trying to really control the narrative of the way we tell stories. So part of my job was to collect things that would help to tell the story of African Americans in the city of St. Louis. Now, the lifeblood, I always tell people when I go out and talk to people and try to get them to donate to the History Museum, is that, the lifeblood of a museum is exhibitions. Okay? That's the way we tell stories. And the lifeblood of an exhibition are objects. You gotta have something. You gotta have the things to tell the story with. So if you don't have those things, it's not that you can't still tell the story, but you're limited in the story. And that is something that we want to correct here. So, and this is a quote from H.W. Brands, not my favorite historian, but I like what he said. And he said, why is it that people save letters, things, items, so they can become part of the public record? It's not a part of the public record. If it's not a part of the public record, you don't exist. Memory fades. And we know that. And that's particularly true of African American history. Let me go back. And just to give you kind of a peek at the kind of things we collect, the whole range of things. For example, that first document up there is a flyer. And it's a flyer from the NAACP student chapter at Washington University. It's dated 1959. And they were asking for support of Washington University students who were arrested for demonstrating at a restaurant in University City called Santoro's that didn't allow black people to eat in that restaurant. So this tells a story. It tells a story about student activism. It tells a story about segregation. It tells many stories. And this can be the beginning of a story that we'd like to tell. That other photograph up there, because we like to collect photographs as well, is a student demonstration in front of Clark School. And they were, this was like the decade of the 60s, and they were marching in support of a school tax. And what I like about this, first of all, we don't have many things from children, and that's one of the things I want to increase, because children are part of the story too that often get ignored. So I like that photograph. And this is from a gentleman by the name of Ivan James Sr. And he was many things, but he was African American, very much involved in the whole in scouting. And this is his jacket. It's one of the largest collections we have, by the way. His sons first started giving to us in 1995. And just late last year, he was still donating things from Ivan James. So it's really a large collection. But this is a Boy Scout jacket from Ivan James. So this tells a story. And this is really interesting. This is Michelle magazine. A gentleman by the name of James Cotter, Carl Bruce, and George Cotton decided that they wanted to start a high concept, sort of glossy magazine that focused on black accomplishments in St. Louis. So they launched this magazine called Michelle. He named it after his daughter. That's Ozzie Smith there. And the magazine lasted about 2 years. They weren't able to really get the kind of ad revenues that they wanted. But he gave us all the existing copies. It's not a full run, but that tells a lot about the history of St. Louis. And this was like 1984. So that 84 to 86, it really documents a lot of what was going on in St. Louis at that time. He didn't give up. I think it was about 1998, he started another magazine that was based on the same concept, and he called it A Magazine. And that lasted for a little longer, maybe 5 or 6 years. And he also gave us copies of that magazine. And then this last object here is a Belva tin. And it has a hair pomade, a pressing oil. And we always think about Annie Malone. Most of us know about Annie Malone and the hair care business that she built in St. Louis. But she wasn't the only one. You know, there was a gentleman named Harry Douglas, he and his wife, Ella and Harry Douglas. They started Belva in 1930, about the same time that Annie Malone decided to leave St. Louis. And this became a national brand. In fact, some of his products, like Hair Rep, I don't know if you're familiar with Hair Rep, but anyway, that's still being produced today. So that just gives you an idea of the kind of things that we're interested in. It doesn't have to be unique or distinctive, or it doesn't have to be something that belonged to someone who was famous or well known. We want to document everyday life of everyday black people. Okay, so I want to talk about work, because one of our weaknesses in our collection, and it's not just in the African American collection, but other curators have this problem too, that they say they don't get enough from workers. And I'm going to be defining work very broadly here. But we really want to start collecting more from working class people. When the Missouri Historical Society was founded in 1866, it was founded, of course, by wealthy white males, and they collected from wealthy white males, or maybe the appendage of a wealthy white male. They didn't really care that much about, or it didn't occur to them about African Americans, about women, about workers. I will give them credit because they did want to preserve the history of the indigenous people. But other than that, most of what we collected focused on the lives and accomplishments of wealthy white males. So we want to get more in our collection that reflects a more diverse and a broader history of St. Louis. And part of that is workers and unions. So this is a really large collection that we brought in, and it's the Black Firefighters Collection. And FIRE, by the way, stands for the Firefighters Institute of Racial Equality. Now, when the fire department was started, they didn't really have, when it became professional, not when it was volunteer, but when it became professional, blacks were not included. They didn't get their first black firefighters till about 1920. And during that time, there was a quota system. Only so many blacks could be hired. They couldn't be promoted. You couldn't get much higher than a private. And so in 1967, the black firefighters started an organization called FIRE, Firefighters Institute for Racial Equality. And they decided that they were going to fight this policy that put a quota on the number of blacks that could be hired. In 1967, I think only 6% of the firefighters were African American, and at that time about 40% of the population of the city of St. Louis was black. There were only 4 black captains. So they decided that they were going to sue the city. 1967, they formed an organization called FIRE. They sued the city. 10 years later, the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that the city of St. Louis would have to promote a black fire captain, a black to the position of captain for every white person that was promoted to the position of captain. So in 1978, 10 years later, St. Louis for the first time had 12 black fire captains because they had 12 white fire captains. And there was this banner headline in the St. Louis American that said, St. Louis gets more black firefighters in one day than in the last 100 years. That wasn't quite accurate, but basically. Okay. But anyway, so we were able to collect different items to tell the story of not just fire, because they gave us documents, they gave us photographs, they even gave us moving images. But one of the things we were interested in was collecting their uniforms that helped to tell the story. These boots, for instance, by the way, St. Louis didn't get its first female firefighters until 1989. It got 5. And 2 of them were black, 3 of them were white. And so these are the boots of Anita Stewart, who was one of the first 5 black firefighters. So we're trying to tell the whole story of the firefighters. Okay. Now you might think this one is a little strange, because it's Katherine Dunham. But she's a worker. And these are the tools of her trade, which is her costumes, her headdress. Katherine Dunham, as you know, was this really famous black dancer. She's noted for the Dunham technique, which is the basis of modern African-American dance. She came to East St. Louis, basically, in 1964. She was an artist in residence at SIUE. She started an art center, and she taught dance here. Katherine Dunham died in 2006. This is one of our largest collections. There are over 500 items in this collection. So in addition to her costumes, which are really so important to this collection, we also have photographs and documents and even some moving images as well. So. Now this is Reverend Ellie Collier's minister robes. Ellie Collier was the founder with his brother of Collier Brothers Auto Body. And most people, are you familiar with that? Okay, Collier is on Delmar. They started that business in 1946. Still exists today, is run by Ellie Collier's son and Raymond Collier's grandson, right? And is one of the oldest existing black businesses in the city from 1946 until today. But anyway, Ellie Collier, in addition to being the founder and owner of Collier Brothers Auto Body, also became a minister. And these are 2 of his robes that his niece donated to the History Museum. It's the first time we got minister's robes. But these are the tools of his trade. Of course, we'd like other things that's one of the other things that we need to bolster our collection. we want to reflect church life as well. So, you know, be nice to have maybe his Bible or something, or maybe some pews, you know, just things that would help us tell the story of churches in St. Louis. What we've been better at getting with things like church programs from a lot of black churches. Now this is Captain Kevin East jacket, cap, and ID badge. In 1992, Kevin East became the first African American to pass the captain's test that was given by the Coast Guard. He went on to be the youngest at 23 to actually helm two boats, the Becky Thatcher and the Tom Sawyer. And so that is his uniform, his cap, and his ID badge. And he's still doing that, by the way. And we did an oral history with him as well. Just to show you that things can be pretty mundane, but they can still tell a powerful story. I mean, this is like an egg beater and some pans. But they belong to a woman by the name of Ann Neely, who was a caterer. She was born in 1888. And according to her great-nephew, who donated these items, she had a clientele, fairly wealthy clientele, and I think she ran her business till about 1965. So it tells many stories. It tells the story of a businesswoman. It tells a story about the kind of work that black women did. And it can tell a story about just domestic life, which we're also interested in. How did everyday people function in this city? And how did they function? What did they do? What did they do it with? This is another really mundane item, but it's the desk set that belonged to David Grant. That's David Grant, that tall gentleman over there that's standing behind Jordan Chambers. David Grant was this legendary civil rights attorney. Born in 1903, graduated from Sumner High School, which was the only high school he could go to at the time because there was the only high school for black students in the city of St. Louis. Went to Michigan, I think, got his BA, then went to Howard Law School, came back to St. Louis, got involved in civil rights struggles here. He was the lawyer for a group called the Colored Clerk Circle, which in the 1930s was engaging in direct action by picketing stores in the black community with a black clientele that would not hire black people. And I like this story because it is direct action, because they were picketing these stores, they were protesting in front of these stores, and when they were threatened with arrest, this was the man that usually blocked that or got them out of jail, David Grant. He was also involved in the Citizen Civil Rights Committee. That was a group of black and white women that were sitting in at downtown, lunch counters at downtown department stores, protesting the fact that they did not serve African Americans. He was the lawyer for that group, and he was also one of the leaders of the March on Washington movement. 1942, the movement that was started by A. Philip Randolph and the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters that were protesting the fact that blacks were not getting jobs in the defense industry. So in 1957, he was also in the Jefferson Bank demonstrations. So he was running the full circle as far as civil rights activity in St. Louis was concerned, from the 1930s to the 1960s. But in 1957, he was hired by the Board of Aldermen to be the research director. And when he passed, the city of St. Louis gave his secretary his desk set, and they also gave his wife a proclamation, and his wife gave a proclamation to his secretary. Her name was Rita Davis, by the way, and she donated these items to the History Museum. And you might think, well, you know, this is a desk set. There's nothing special about that. But it's the story that it helps us to tell about David Grant and his career. And it's the only physical representation of this really important man that we have in our collection. And this is Dr. Whitteko's surgical tools. I'm sure some of you remember Dr. Whitteko. Know Dr. Whitteko? Dr. Whitteko practiced, he came to St. Louis in 1942. I'll just give you a little bit of background. He was born in West Virginia. His father was a doctor. He wound up going to Lincoln University in Pennsylvania. Then he went to Meharry Medical School, graduated from Meharry Medical School. And so where do you go when you're a young young future doctor, you need to get training. You come to St. Louis and you come to Homer G. Phillips, because that's one of the few places, if you're African American, that you can get training. And he came here to be a surgical intern in 1940. 1942, he went into the Army. When he came out, he resumed his medical practice. He resumed his training, started medical practice. For the next 65 years, he practiced medicine. He stopped practicing medicine in his 90s. But when he passed, his son donated it's an awful photograph, by the way, but his medical tools. And this is really a large collection that we got as well, because Dr. Whitaco saved everything. So we have his medical tools, we have his World War II uniform. By happenstance, I happened to find out that he had suits, custom-made suits that were made by a gentleman called Raymond Dennis from Bell and Bow. Do any of you remember Bell and Bow? Okay, he had custom-made suits from, tailor-made, custom-made suits from Raymond Dennis and Bell and Bow, which started us on another collecting initiative to try and get more things from Raymond Dennis, but that's another story. But this turned out to be part of a collecting initiative in and of itself, because we decided we wanted to get more things that told the story of black medicine in St. Louis. We do have a large collection from Homer G. Phillips Hospital when it closed. We have some other things from other doctors. We have like a dentist bag, which I didn't know even dentists had bags that they carried their tools in, from Ivan James Sr. When I talked about that red Boy Scouts uniform, that was Ivan James Jr. Well, his father was a dentist, and his grandsons gave us his medical tools, his dental tools. Dr. Gladney and other doctors we're collecting from as well. And this, Raymond, going back to the Colliers, Raymond, the Collier brothers were very entrepreneurial. They were always starting businesses. And one of the business, by the way, that's a little Collier brothers patch. I just stuck that on there, where they're located now, a little advertisement for the Collier brothers. But he started a business called Arrow Security, Raymond Collier did. And this is his ID tag, a patch, and his badge. And he operated that business for about 10 years. And he got some pretty big contracts, the St. Louis Board of Education, Faith Hospital, Woolworths. So he was very much engaged. You're going to see some other things from the Colliers as we go along through this presentation. Let me go back. Okay, Catherine Nelson. Catherine Nelson is another fairly well-known person in St. Louis. She was an educator and she was a civic leader. She was born in Detroit when she was 5. The family moved to Memphis, Tennessee. She went to Lemoyne College. When she graduated from Lemoyne, she went to Union Theological Seminary, and she also went to Columbia School, University Teachers College. Well, she had a very interesting career. When she graduated, she went to New Mexico and worked on a reservation, a Navajo reservation, as a missionary. Then she went to Haiti and was a missionary in Haiti for 5 years, became very fluent in French. Then she came to St. Louis in 1950, and this is where she got married, made her home. She started a pre-kindergarten class at what is now it's called the Bear Y, but at that time it was the Monsanto Y. Even before that, it was the Page Park Y. It's been through a lot of iterations, this particular Y. But she started a pre-kindergarten class that some argue was the basis for Head Start, was one of the models for Head Start. But she was a really noted educator. Then she became a civic leader. She was the program director for the Danforth Foundation. She was on the Forest Park Forever, not Forest Park Forever, the Forest Park Advisory Board, and she helped to develop the master plan for Forest Park. She was on the library, the board of the library. She was just very, very civically engaged. And her daughter gave us these items. She gave us photographs, her diplomas. She even gave us her passport. So that would help us to tell the story of Catherine Nelson. That was a story that appeared in St. Louis Magazine about Catherine Nelson. And this is one of my favorites, Rosebud Gaines. And not just because her name is Rosebud, but I love her name. But Rosebud Gaines was, this ties into the whole history of the beauty care industry. St. Louis, for those of you who might not be aware. St. Louis is known as kind of a hair town as far as black people are concerned because we had so many hair care businesses here. Of course, we had Annie Malone. Of course, Madam C.J. Walker launched her career here, talked about Belva, and there were just so many. And one of them was Rosebud Gaines. And Rosebud Gaines started off operating a salon in the Ville, and then she started this Rosebud Beauty Academy, which she located on Delmar. But what I like about these photographs is because we have the interior, of her business. That's Rosebud Gaines with some of her students. On that far end are some of her graduates. But I think these are kind of rare photographs. Very seldom do we get offers like this where we see the inside of a business. And then I want to talk a little bit about social life, because we want to collect more that reflects the social life of African Americans. Well, we want more that talks about clubs. We want more that talks about fraternal organizations, fraternities, sororities, and just throw in recreation and sports as well. By the way, that's a group of members from Kappa Alpha Psi from 1935 that are standing in front of Poro College. Prosperous looking black men. Now this is Jack Larry's Fez. He was a Mason, a Prince Hall Mason. Jack Larry was a local businessman, was also very heavily involved in Republican politics, African American, and he donated many things to us as well. He was also in the Korean War, so he donated things that reflected his time in the Korean War, but I was really interested in his time in the Masons. And so he gave us that fez, and he gave us an apron and some gloves, some other ceremonial regalia. We also collected things like that from Dr. Whitaker as well, and from Raymond Collier as well. In fact, that ring is a Mason ring that belongs to Raymond Collier. This is kind of an interesting story because like I said, we had things from Raymond Collier, things from Jack Larry, things from Dr. Whitaker, that were all part of the Prince Hall Masons. But we didn't have anything from women. And I just happened to be commiserating with a friend of mine saying I would really like to get something from the Order of the Eastern Star, the Daughters of Tabor. I said, naming these different female affiliates of the Prince Hall Masons and these other male organizations. And she said, well, my mother was a member of the Order of Eastern Star, which I didn't know. And she said, I'm going to look in my basement and see if I can find it. And she did. She looked in the basement. She found it, and she donated it. So you never know what you have in your basement, in your attic. It's something that we could probably add to our collection and tell a story, because this tells a story. It launched me on this whole research adventure, finding out as much as I could about the Order of Eastern Star. In fact, it started here in 1887, and the first worthy matron in 1887 was Lucy Delaney. Lucy Delaney, who wrote the book From the Darkness Cometh the Light, who talks about her life in growing up enslaved and how she sued for her freedom. So turns out you can find many interesting stories from items that might seem very everyday, ordinary, mundane. Let me go back. Oh, now this is really interesting. This might be the oldest thing that I actually brought in. And it's about a group called the Informal Dames. They were started in 1901. And one of the descendants of the Informal Dames gave us the minutes, two typescript histories of the club, a list of the original members, photographs. And one of the founders of the original Dames, the Informal Dames, was Susan P. Vachon, Susan Paul Vachon, who was the wife of George Vachon, the mother of John Boyer Vachon, who Vachon High School is named after, was part of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. So this opened up so many stories. And Emma Gosselin, who was also a Vachon, and was also one of the original members of this. And just to read these minutes from the early 20th century, It's really fascinating. It gives us a whole glimpse into the life of these elite black women at this time in St. Louis. And as you can see, they look very well turned. And we want more about clubs. I mean, we have the Links, we have the Top Ladies of Distinction, the Coalition of 100 Black Women. We want more information about black club life, not just from 100 years or 120 years ago, but even contemporary. And going back to that first photograph, that title photograph, where you talk about those gentlemen in front of Poro College, Poro, in 1935. They were probably here for this, the annual meeting that was held here in St. Louis in 1935. And this also came from the same person that gave us the information about the informal dames. Her father was a Kappa, Kappa Alpha Psi, black fraternity. And this was the original photograph that they took in 1935, which is really a rare find. Delta Sigma Theta pillow. We also have a Delta Sigma Theta paddle, but we want more things that reflect these sororities. Of course, Delta was founded in, God, it escapes me. Was it 1913? Yeah. 1913. Okay. We have some deltas. No deltas. Okay. But yeah, we want to tell more of this story. And this is AKAs. We have deltas. You got to have AKAs. You got to have sigmas. You got to have more than just deltas and AKs. But this was taken in 1945, and this was taken by a woman who was a member. The woman who was a member of this particular group of AKAs gave us this photograph. And the AKAs, of course, were founded on Howard University's campus, just like the deltas were, but it was founded by St. Louis Ethel Hedgeman Lyle. So that's another whole story. Now, this, I think, is really interesting. It's Arthur Kennedy Jr. and the Gateway Boat Club. Arthur Kennedy Jr. was a speedboat racer. He passed away, I think he was born in 1944, passed away in 1992. When he passed away in 1992, the official organ of the speedboat sport, they published an article about him. And they said he was to speedboat racing what Jackie Robinson was to baseball. He broke the color bar in speedboat racing. And he's a St. Louisan. His father was a speedboat racer. His father gave him his first boat when he was 8 years old. And he started racing when he was 8. And he went on to it became a really big part of his life because he won so many trophies and awards. I think he might have been at its height, maybe one of only 6 black speedboat racers in the country. And he was the only one to win the kind of awards and trophies that he won. Now in 1955, he started a boating club. At that time, there was only 3 of them, but he started, it wasn't called the Gateway Boating Club at that time, but he started a boating club. That boating club was incorporated in 1965, and they changed their name to the Gateway Boat Club. It still exists today. Did you?
Where did they race?
I'm sorry?
Where did they race?
All over. I think right now I think they're moored in Alton. Now, he raced all over the country. He even went to Europe and raced. He was everywhere. He was a speedboat racer. And I like this story because now this is the only black boating club in St. Louis, which I'm sure doesn't surprise you, and one of the few in the country. And I like this particular story because I don't think we necessarily think of black people in this way as being members of a boating club. That's not a cheap recreation or hobby to have. And it definitely wasn't a cheap sport to pursue. By the way, when he passed away, his wife gave us his life jacket, some model boats, lots of photographs. That's Arthur Kennedy Jr. in one of his speedboats. And I don't have to say anything about this. Everybody knows Jackie Joyner's Kersey. And these are Jackie Joyner Kersey's running shoes. So everybody knows her story. So I'm not going to say much about that. But we would like to do more with black sports and black sporting figures. That's something that I'm pursuing now. Is trying to get in more things into our collection that tell the story of black sports in St. Louis. The other thing is that we want to really add more work by a black art and a black artist. And we always like to get donations. But, you know, sometimes we commission black art or we'll buy black art. This, by the way, is a piece that was done by two artists, Robert Ketchens and, is that Mr. Ketchens? And William Burton Jr. And they did this for the #1 in civil rights. This image doesn't do it justice, so I'll apologize for that. But two really amazing artists that we've added this to our permanent collection. And of course, it's scenes from the civil rights movement. I think that's the title of the piece. Is that right, Robert?
Yes.
Okay. Because you probably recognize some of those people: Frankie Freeman, Percy Green, Dred Scott, Charlton Tandy, Margaret Bush Wilson, Pearl Maddox. Got it. Okay. Okay. So I'm just going to highlight some of the art pieces. This is a piece by William Burton. And William Burton does this intricate wood burning, that technique, that is just amazing to see up close and personal. I wish I could have it on the stage here. But that's a piece that he did of John Milton Turner. John Milton Turner was born in St. Charles, Missouri, enslaved, 1839, 1840, 1841. We're not quite sure when he was born, but somewhere around there. He went on to be, as what the St. Louis Argus said when he died, they said he was the most important Negro to ever emerge from St. Louis. He was an activist, civil rights activist, helped to found Lincoln University. At the end of the Civil War, before the passage of the 15th Amendment, he was head of the Missouri Equal Rights League that was really fighting for the franchise for black males. He went on to be the second African American to be a diplomat and the first African American to be the ambassador to Liberia. So that was an important part of the story of blacks in St. Louis. And a stunning piece. This is another piece by Robert Ketchens, which is of George Vaughan. George Vaughan was another one of these legendary civil rights attorneys. He's the lawyer that argued the Shelley versus Kramer case in 1948. And that was the case that ruled restrictive covenants were unenforceable. So a really groundbreaking civil rights case. This is a piece by Dale Chambers, which is a drawing of Mary Meacham. Of course, Mary Meacham was the wife of John Berry Meacham, and together they founded a school in the basement of First Baptist Church. First Baptist Church founded in 1829, the first black church in the city of St. Louis. Of course, that school was broken up in 1847 when the Missouri legislature outlawed the teaching of black children. She went on to be, all this time, she was involved in the Underground Railroad, and it's been documented. A lot of stories about the Underground Railroad we're not too sure about, but there's actual documentation of her involvement in the Underground Railroad because she was caught and she was prosecuted. She was acquitted and the other charges were dropped, but again, an important figure in St. Louis African American history. And we had no representations of her. This is probably not the way she looked, by the way, because we don't have any real images of her, but this is the image that Dale chose to represent her. And this is By the way, Dale Chambers' brother is Darnell Chambers, and he did this rendering of Charlton Tandy. Again, another really important figure in St. Louis history. He's the man that's given a lot of credit for, well, let me just say, St. Louis was a segregated city. It was just as segregated as any city in Mississippi or Alabama or Florida or Georgia. It was segregated. The only thing that was not segregated in this city was public transportation. And a lot of that credit goes to Charlton Tandy. Right after the Civil War, blacks started protesting the fact that they could not ride on the inside of trolley cars. And a lot of time, and in fact, there were two suits even before Charlton Tandy that sued because they were not allowed on the inside of those trolley cars. But even though those people won their suits and there was an injunction, it didn't stop the practice. And Charlton Tandy, and I like the story because it's another story of direct action. He would actually, well, they say that when a trolley car tried to pass up black people, rather than let them get on and sit where they wanted to sit, just kept going. And Charlton Tandy would actually grab the reins of the horse and would not let that trolley car move until they allowed black people onto that trolley car and they can sit wherever they want. So even at the height of segregation in this city, and of course we had segregation, even though segregation wasn't legal, in this, we had no laws on the books that mandated segregation except for schools and intermarriage. But other than that, it was all custom and tradition and practice. And that was the case until 1961, when the city finally passed a public accommodations law. But of all the things that were segregated, blacks couldn't go to the movie theaters, they couldn't go to restaurants, no hotels, everything was segregated except public transportation in the city of St. Louis, which is remarkable. By the way, let me just say, Emily Davis is not black. Emily Davis is white. But I included this because Emily Davis was a Ferguson activist, very much involved in the Ferguson protest movement. And she painted this piece that, you know, during the Ferguson protests and a lot of the protest movements, they would cover the storefronts with this plywood and artists would paint on it. And she painted this mural, Still We Rise. And she took that quote from a Maya Angelou poem and was inspired by it. So this was the first Ferguson mural that we were able to collect. We were able to collect a few more, and we've also collected some from South Grand. I don't know if you remember, right after Michael Brown's death, a young man called Von Derek Myers was also killed by the police in that area, and there were the same kind of protest and the same kind of artwork emerged from that. And I think it's interesting that this artwork is emerging from all of these protest movements that are surrounding basically the murder of young black men and women. And this is a piece, and this is a huge, huge piece. It's by an artist called Malcolm McRae. And this happened after the Jason Stokely was acquitted for the killing of Anthony Lamar Smith. And of course, a lot of stores got a little nervous, and they immediately put up plywood because they expected violence, and they didn't want to get their businesses attacked or vandalized. And this was on a AT&T building in South Brentwood. And of course, there was no real violence. But again, this was a piece that I thought was striking, and I thought it would add to our collection. Now, this is two other paintings that we collected. One, this is a painting by Clarence Shivers, and this doesn't really do it justice. I couldn't get the image I wanted. Clarence Shivers was a Tuskegee Airman. He's no longer with us. But he developed into a very fine artist. He was, of course, born in St. Louis, graduated from Sumner, went into the Army, became a Tuskegee Airman, didn't actually get to do any flights because the war ended before that he was able to be engaged in combat. Then he went to Spain, and that's where he made his reputation. He lived in Spain for 10 years, got a lot of acclaim as an artist. Never came back to St. Louis, but he then went to Colorado, where he established a firm footing in the art community there. And his daughter-in-law, his daughter-in-law gave us that painting. No, his sister was also an artist. I'm gonna show you a piece by her. And so we have these brother and sister artists. This is the first time we have brother and sister artists. We have Darnell and Dale Chambers, and now we have Clarence Shevers and Alice Hudson, two brother-sister artists, only ones in our collection. So anyway, but he went on to do a lot of work for the U.S. Army. He had a lot of, he was a very successful artist, so we were lucky to get this piece that was donated to us. And this is the other piece, which is not a good image, but this is his sister. She was also a very well-known artist. And we don't have enough work by black female artists in our collection. We don't have enough work by black male artists in our collection. We definitely don't have enough by black female artists. So we feel very fortunate to be able to get this piece that was donated to us by the daughter-in-law of Alice Hudson, who's no longer with us, by the way. She was very successful in St. Louis, but it points to some of the struggles of black artists. She was never able to pursue her art full-time, which she wanted to do. She was a nurse by training. And then we go black voices. Black voices are very important, historians, academics. A lot of times they rely on papers and documents, all the things that help them to tell the story. They have to document and verify. And I think some of the most important resources we have are first-person testimonies. The people that actually lived through these events, who can tell us their stories and can fill in the gaps that maybe the documents don't tell us. So we're trying to have a very vigorous oral history component to the African American History Initiative. So this is Martin Matthew, who was one of the founders with Hubert Dickey of Matthew Dickey's Boy Club, who died recently. And I was fortunate enough to be able to interview him before he died. And I wanted to get more of the story of Matthew's Dickey. So I did also interview Barbara Washington, who was like his right-hand woman, and Tom Sullivan, who grew up in the Matthew Dickey Boys Club and succeeded Mr. Matthew when he passed as the director of the Matthew Dickey Boys Club. And another thing we're doing now, we're doing a Mill Creek Oral History Project, which is ongoing, and those are just some of the people that we've interviewed already, which is Vivian Gibson, who wrote the book, The Last Children of Mill Creek. We interviewed her. That book, Mother Wit, was actually written by my sister, who grew up in Mill Creek. This Alberta Beckwith is the woman I was telling you about. I think I mentioned her. She's like 104. Sharp as a tack, sharp as a tack. And to talk to someone who remembers Mill Creek in the 20s is so rare. To tell us what it was like growing up there is really, really just almost unbelievable. And that's what I say about getting the first-person testimony, the stories of the people that actually lived through these events. Then I talked about the black firefighters and the collection that we got from them. And we're also doing an oral history project, which is ongoing as well, that are interviewing black firefighters, talking about their experiences in the fire department. St. Louis did not start integrating its firehouses until 1958. And of course, 1958 to 1978, they were sort of limited in the roles that they could play within the fire department. Couldn't get much higher than a private. There was a quota system. They put a cap on the number of black firefighters that could be hired. And a lot of these people experience that firsthand and talk about how difficult it was, which is interesting. And you know, with fire departments, like they say, it's one of the hardest things to integrate because you actually have to live with the person. You have to live together. There's no other job where I don't have to live with anybody here. If you're a policeman, you don't have to live with the people. If you're a teacher, you don't have to live with, these people have to live together and eat together and sleep together, which makes it difficult. And they talk about those experiences. We also had a Ferguson Oral History project and a Ferguson collecting initiative where we did collect from, we wanted to collect from a lot of the grassroots protesters. We were interested in what motivated them to, some of these people had never participated in a protest before. What motivated them to get out on the street and maybe risk being tear gassed or abused in some way? And what kept them going back? What motivated them? So we did interview some of those people that were involved in the grassroots protesting, and many photographs. I think we might have, I don't know how many, I can't even count the number of photographs, and moving images that we have of the protests, in addition to some of the objects. And that leads to, we're doing more, that whole Ferguson collecting initiative, the Ferguson Oral History Project, led us to concentrate more on what we call social justice collecting and social justice oral histories. We want to do more of that. And this is just some random items, you know, of the things that we collect, the things that we want to collect. We collect objects, photographs, moving images, papers and documents. And that could be letters, it could be club minutes, it could be programs, posters, playbills, signs, yearbooks, which is an object. But, you know, this, for example, is a plaque. Usually we don't take plaques. But this was a plaque that was given to Carrie Bash. And Carrie Bash was in line to become the first black woman to head the Urban League. That was after William Dothert retired. But as the story goes, some of the, how should I put this? Some of the downtown business interests did not think that St. Louis was ready to have this black woman head the Urban League, and they chose a male instead. That is Arthur Kennedy, the speedboat racer. Those are the cleats of a Negro League baseball player. There, got the Belvedere again. This is a dress, a gown that was done by a woman called Mabel Preston. And it's one of the few examples. We talked about Dennis and his custom-made suits. Well, this was a woman who did custom-made dresses, and that's one of her dresses. So that fills in a gap of the garment industry. I know we're going to have a program on the garment industry, and what I'm trying to do is bring in more things that reflect the black side of that story of the garment industry. Of course, we got Belva again, chose. I like Michelle magazine. And this is a photograph from Washington Tabernacle Church. And Washington Tabernacle Church is one of those older black churches. It burned down, and it took them until 1949 before they were able to get to another church, to rebuild their church. And in 1949, they put out this program that told the history of the church and everything that and brought us up to date until 1949. And when this was given to us, it wasn't in the best of shape, as you might be able to tell, but it told the whole history of Washington Tabernacle Church. And the interesting thing I like about church programs, and we collect obituaries too, I should have mentioned that, because they do tell a story that you don't get in sort of the official versions. And so it tells a whole history of Washington Tabernacle that we might not have had. And churches routinely do that. They do tell their histories. And it's like an obituary. An obituary will tell a history of a person that we might not be able to get anywhere else, especially if the person is not famous or well known. So, H.W. Brands again, like I said, not necessarily my favorite historian, but I like what he says. He said, if your letters your things are saved and deposited in the local historical society, that's us, you will become immortal because historians will come along and write about you. And they do. I mean, we have historians coming to, and researchers coming to the Library and Research Center all the time, looking for documents, looking for things. And if they find them, they can write about them. If they're not there, they can't. It's just as simple as that. So, that is a flyer from the African American History Initiative. And I would like to encourage you to look in your, maybe not in your basements, but maybe your basements or your attics. And you probably have things that would be of some value that we would treasure. What so happens so often is that people throw things out because they say, you're not interested in that. And I always say, wait a minute, let us look at it. Give us a chance, and we'll tell you whether we're interested or not. And 9 times out of 10, we're interested. So I see, am I done? So I don't know if anybody has any questions, comments. Oh, you got one card? One question, okay. Let me see what it says. What should we take?
Evaluations and index cards when you came in. If you have a question, please write it on the index card and I will come around and get that for you. Also, if you didn't get an index card, raise your hand and Jeannie is going to walk around and give you one. Thank you.
Okay, it says, what should we tell others who are not here today to hear your talk? Other than, you know, we value the African American experience. And that means we value African American things. We value your objects. We value your papers. We value your photographs. We value what you have because it is important. If we don't have your things, we can't tell the real story. We can't tell the authentic story. We can't tell the truth. And when we're living in a time when we have, in fact, it's being debated in the Missouri Assembly right now, a bill to try and limit the teaching of certain aspects of our history. And I always say, you know, we have a positive side of our history, but we have a dark side. The two sides are the same coin. You can't tell the positive side unless you tell the dark side. If I want to tell the story of emancipationists in St. Louis, I have to tell the story of enslavement. If I want to tell the story of civil rights activists in the city of St. Louis, which is the positive side of the story, I have to tell the negative side of the story, which is segregation. So you can't tell one side of the story without telling the other side of the story. It's delusional. And I think that's what these legislatures, who I think are basically trying to pander to a certain segment of their electorate, don't seem to understand or don't care. You've got to tell the whole story. Otherwise, it's not history. It's something else. I don't want to call it myth, but it is something else. So I want people to understand. You know, anybody that if you want to tell people about what this was about, it's about collecting things from the black community, from African Americans that help us to tell this story, because we are going to tell that story. And you can help us to tell that story by giving us things that help us to do that. Okay? So with that, I guess we can close out. Have no more questions? Comments?